I'll wait till Bo gets here. Is he up there?
Oh, he said he was going to project up there, so we got it.
Okay.
Did you want me to pass these out? These are same copies of that, or no?
Oh,
Did you want?
sure. Thank you. I didn't even think of that. Yes, can you just put these on the podium for me? And is that the mic that you're going to? I might take the mic from you after you speak.
Okay. Are you mic'd up? Okay. We're ready? Well, good evening, everyone. I can talk and walk down a set of stairs. I guess I'm not as old as I thought I was. I didn't do the tumble forward. Well, thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to Epworth United Methodist Church. And welcome certainly to our friends online. Glad to have you through live stream, whether you're watching it tonight or watch it during the week. We're glad to have you here. Tonight is our second event of what we're calling an author series here at Epworth. And we have a new initiative, what we're calling the learning community, and it's all about offering classes into the community, speakers. We've been teaching classes. You know, at Epworth, we really are about exploring our faith and embracing our community. And tonight is all about the second piece of that, and that is embracing the wonderful community around us. So what do we hope to do through this learning community? It's pretty simple. We really want to feature thought leaders who help our community promote respectful dialogue. I love the last two words, respectful dialogue. If you think of Epworth, I think that's what we're so proud of, being an inclusive environment for learning, for living, just being part of this great community. So back in March, we heard from John Archibald, whose brother Murray is extremely involved in the church and community. Many of you know him. And he had a great conversation about his latest book, Shaking the Gates of Hell. And essentially his book was based on Martin Luther King's very famous message from a Birmingham jail. And essentially it was an indictment of Martin Luther King's fellow clergy on how they remained silent through some of the most difficult, struggling times race relations our country's ever had. Arguably, we're not out of that discussion yet. We're still wrestling with it, and our speaker tonight will talk about that. But the interesting thing about John's message was he also included his father, who was a Methodist pastor. How can you be silent through this whole experience? And it was just a great event. So tonight, we have the privilege of having Janus Adams join us tonight. Janus is a historian, Emmy Award-winning journalist, best-selling author of 11 books, and host of the Janus Adams Show on public radio. She'll share her journey and ideas for how we can find and use our voice for the cause of justice, to turn silence into action. A quick aside, Janus and I are personal friends. Janus, we met October 21st, 2019. I went back and looked. And until yesterday, that was the last time we had physically seen each other. She lives in upstate New York. I'm down here. COVID, everything else. She was a guest speaker at a conference I went to, a women's leadership development conference. I was on their board. And Janus was one of our speakers. And Janus, I think we both got in like 8:30 at night. We're in the hotel lobby. The restaurant's about to close. We hadn't eaten. We looked at each other and said, "You got dinner plans?" And what a friendship grew from that. Isn't it funny how life works sometimes? So great to have you here. To introduce Janus, I want to share just a couple excerpts from a letter that Peter Buffett, Warren Buffett's son, very active in upstate New York and in philanthropy and things, he wrote a letter to his community. Our core focus will, as it always has at our foundation, to remain and will remain unchanged. The life and agency of a black girl. Her future is our future. And our shared future has become more precarious over the past decade. By nearly every metric, our culture is in a tailspin. Gender, patriarchy, race, white, economic structure, capitalism are often identified as the reasons. But how those elements have intersected and embedded themselves into our daily lives is almost too painful to accept. How those elements can build a structure upon structure for hundreds of years that makes the possibility of change seem unimaginable. Until you talk with a black girl. The pain and possibility live side by side for her. A constant reminder of the systems that are built to hold her back and the spirit that's required to imagine a new world. Please help me welcome my special friend, Janus, who was and now champions for that little black girl. Please help me welcome Janus Adams.
Body, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Keep on a walking, keep on a talking, walking down the freedom trail. Thank you so much for having me. Todd, thank you so much for that welcome. In the midst of all that is going on, I thought I would begin with that anthem because we'll be talking about a little of that tonight. But before that, I want to start in a slightly different place. I'm going to open by reading to you from my book, Sister Days, 365 Inspired Moments in African American History. And I'm going to open there because in the midst of all that's going on, sometimes we just need a little perspective. In the beginning, the story is told, this is how things came to be. The who was who and what was what between man and woman. What the gods had given man, what the gods had given woman. What he could do, she could do. What he had in knowledge and strength, she had too. Everything was even, for that was God's plan. Then one day the two got into a terrible row. Maybe that snake grass thing again when the gods called man to account and he blamed woman for tempting him with her apple pie. Maybe it was something like that. But whatever it was, it went on so long that man finally walked out, slammed the garden gate, and went up to heaven to have a talk with God. There's got to be a way to put an end to all this commotion, man said to himself. And all the while he's walking, he's talking to himself, he's remembering the good times when he, man, was in charge of everything, and woman was just a rib. Well, by the time he got to heaven, he knew what he wanted. He said, man walked right up to the God's council and stated his case. He said, God, hold on one second, I'll be right. Oh, let there be light. He said, God, grant me strength to deal with that woman. And God did. God gave man more strength. He knew what he was doing. He had given equally to both, but there was something about that woman that made that creating and sun rising and moon making, a whole lot of fun. But business was business with his extra strength. Man could also better tend the fields and the flock. He raced home to woman, and so it was done. He raced home to woman, and with his strength told him that he was boss now, and with his strength, he was king. Roar. Well, as you can imagine, woman was having none of that. Night and day, she said, day and night, I work my fingers to the bone, and he's the one that gets the strength. No, 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 no. Time to have a talk with God. Now, there's one thing about that talk with God, because her God wouldn't do a thing like that. And wasn't her God a woman? Sorry, yes. So out the garden gate she sped, and up to heaven she went, just like that. Before she knew it, she was there. For once woman made up her mind to do a thing, ladies, you know it's true, the thing gets done. She had heard that just before she got to heaven, she could freshen up a bit at the pearly gates. So she would stop off to do that, shake the dust off her feet, so to speak, out of respect. Well, there at the gates, she spied a set of golden keys. They were exquisite in construct, stunning in simplicity, ageless in design, but this was no time to admire the decor. So at heaven's gate, she turned right and found the gods waiting for her. From what man had said, they knew she would come round in her own time, and she did. Now, God, she said, with all you've given me, I hate to trouble you. But she said, God, whatever that was you gave my man, you need to give him a little less. But God said, no, a gift is a gift. You don't give it back. They could give her more strength too, but keeping man and woman even in all things hadn't worked out according to plan. So she thought, and they thought. They thought, and she thought. Then she remembered the keys at the gate. So you saw the keys to the kingdom, they smiled, all knowing. She could have them if she liked. They knew greater wisdom was a gift she would use well. Well, thankful, she said her praises and rushed home to man. He had his strengths for sure, but she had greater wisdom. And that's why things are the way they are, factually speaking, to this day. Man holds up his end of the bargain for sure, but woman holds the power. So it was told by our mothers' mothers, and so it is to this day true. Women hold the keys to the kingdom. That's why this book is called Sister Days, so we get the authentic perspective. Okay. And the keys to the kingdom. So anyway, woman holds the power. In her wisdom, the great mother has passed on her stories, and from them our herstory has come. Come, 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 let me tell you a Nancy story I would hear my grandmother call when I seemed in need of a little soothing down. Years later, I decoded her Caribbean lilt to learn that a Nancy was a Nancy, the trickster spider who spun a magic web of African lore. But each story, no matter its filigree, would have the same moral, the same reason for being told, to share Grandma's philosophy of life. All things are one, said Grandma. In this world, everything is related. All things are one. And sometimes in her daily sojourn, the endless struggles with her life and times, she would pause, situate herself, and exhale. I'd write a book, she'd say, but who would read it? Knowing her vindication would not soon come. I remember, too, the days my grandfather would walk my cousin and me along the New York Harbor to teach us about geography and life with lessons charted by the ports of call of the ships at shore. And then he'd stand against the pier, his face etched against the sunset, his arm pointing to places he said we would someday have to go to see and to be. Places like Jamestown, Virginia. In August 1619, a Dutch man-of-war ship sailed into harbor in colonial Jamestown, traded its human cargo for food, and launched an industry so successful that even today, nearly 400 years later, more than 400 years later, in fact, this year, 405 years later, vast stretches of the African continent remain underpopulated. Slavery in the Americas consumed more than 100 million lives. Not my quote, not my fact, that of the father of Pan-African history, co-founder of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois. That's his estimate of the number. Visiting that Jamestown site, I marvel at what happened to those first African Americans and what has sustained their descendants, their powerful stories of history, heritage, and hope. A saga I began retelling with Glory Days, my first book, in what became a trilogy. From Glory Days to our Freedom Days, a celebration of the civil rights era at one with the global movement for Pan-African liberation, and now to our Sister Days, the story of our sojourn and our sojourners, of our Harriets and our Hatshepsuts, by our Nailas and our Nefertitis, our Rashidas and our Rosas. And what a history we have made. What stories our lives tell. And ain't I a woman? Sojourner Truth is said to have rallied, challenging the narrowed eye of a norm. With higher expectation, we have conjured a womanhood others have dared attempt to deny and made real the worlds we would behold. It's quite a legacy, as you'll read in these pages, these odes to our womanhood. I remember a conversation I had with an administrator, asked why her school district was so reluctant to include African American history and multicultural perspectives. In the curriculum, she seemed caught off guard, and this is very reminiscent of what we're hearing today. The truth is, she confided, parents and teachers are afraid that if we tell the children the truth, they will think their ancestors were bad. And I couldn't help thinking of all those children so long sacrificed at a blockade of lies that others might be raised isolated from truth. I saw the children and the child within. I heard the voices of the children and those of 80 who remain but a child of God. From them came my inspiration. I knew why I wanted to write, but it was not until I looked into the mirror of memory that I knew what I needed to write. On the days my grandmother would tire, her stories used up, her memories dim, I remember how she would croon to herself, I'd write a book, but who would read it and yet go on? From the collectivity of the stories of our grandmothers untold, and for all of their very great and very grandchildren, here, I hope, is the book they would have written. Here is their power, their strength, their pain, their ways and their better days. Here are their woes and their problem solving, their laughter and their haughty, naughty ways. Here too are our stories, the ones we would put into hope chests, woven into tapestries, knowing that we today are the ancestors of tomorrow. And as you read of these, our sister days, somewhere beyond, our grandmas smile. Somewhere our grandpas glance upon the docks of our day and look to the horizons their dreams helped paint. For you to read, these are the stories they have told me to keep, the measure of our sister days. Inspired moments to alter the blockade to alter the view on both sides of the blockade, to alter the cadence of one who might not otherwise know that her place in this land was staked in Jamestown, bought and paid for in 1619, long, long years ago, that her source has been channeled from a river called the Nile, her river dredged at Timbuktu. Yes, my sister love, so begin our days. Yes, my brother love, so begin our days. There was Boston, Nicodemus, and Mississippi, always Mississippi. New York and Nantucket, and on and on, and so we go on. So begin our sister days. In your hands, I'm going to ask Bo if he will put that image up for me. That image. Okay. There's a reason why that image is up there. I want to talk to you today about where we are today. Oops. Thank you, Reverend Vicki. Thank you. I want to talk to you about where we are today, where our country is, where our world is today. And I want to tell the truth about it. I've asked that that picture be put up so that we could have a conversation today about some of the things that, forget the things that are driving us apart, some of the things that are bringing us together today, some of the questions that we have. And after I have this little talk, I'm going to devote, honestly, most of this time to Q&A so that we can hear from you, so that we can have a conversation. I'm going to move my mic stand, and me down there so I can be closer to you, so that we can pass the mic and we can really come together. What you have in your hand, what Reverend Vicki passed out, is actually a newsletter that I sent out November 12th, 2023. On my show that week, I had as my guest Laura Flanders. And she had just on her show, the Laura Flanders Show, you're familiar with, those of you who are regular public television watchers and public radio fans. She has her own show. And her show, in the wake of October 7th, was with Josh Paul. He was the State Department official whose letter of resignation from the State Department went viral. And he essentially, I have it here, so I won't read it all for you as to why he was resigning. But I'll just say it had everything to do with what our president has finally decided to do, to stop the flow of weapons to Israel, even if just for this moment. And as Laura and I were talking about it, just as journalists, we were saying, you know, how do we tell this story? How do we wrap our hands around it? How do we stop? How do we not go to the day by day, blow by blow, who's winning, who's up, who's down? I do not see my responsibility with all I've been through at this stage in life as being this scorecard. I see it not as just the story of October 7th without us understanding October 7th in perspective. Because when we simply refer to October 7th, we come away with some of the conclusions that we've been coming away with. Even if we go back not just to October 7th, which, as has been said over and over again, one of the greatest assaults on Israel since or on the Israeli people and on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And that is what it was. But we have to even see this in context, because Israel has for 75 years now been occupying and oppressing Palestinian people whose homeland they took over. And that is something that was done at the behest of the United States and England. And England is actually the one behind it. The United States joined in because when the Ottoman Empire was still trying to mess with the Holy Land, England stepped in with a favor to someone who had done the British a favor during the World War I and said, I know what to do. What can I do for your people as Jews? And the comment was said that we need a homeland. It did not happen at that point. Indeed, in Europe, in Christian Europe, Jews had been treated abominably in the name of religion. And so here we were, Laura and I, and we are friends, saying, how do we tell this story? And I wrote this newsletter column that you have. And what isn't on here is that it leads with that picture. That man is Pope Alexander VI. And I'll tell you why I'm starting with that. And it is because Laura and I discussed it. You'll see a section on page 2 of this where we talk about Palestine, but we also talk about Belfast. Laura spent a considerable time in Belfast, and she said it was amazing how much she learned from the people that she was taught by the British people, she's British, to despise and disrespect. And it was amazing how much she had learned. And she said, you know, when I learned from being in Belfast that how you tell the story depends on where you start the clock. Where do we, so we decided we had to really think about where we start the clock when we talk about this crisis that is going on between Israel and Palestine, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And what grievance has really been festering, and for how long? And when you start the clock, that was the takeaway. The beginning was May 4th, 1493, with that man, Pope Alexander, who issued Inter Cetera, a papal bull decree, granting Spain and Portugal the right to do egregious wrong, to conquer, colonize, convert, and enslave the non-Catholic world. And here is the quote. I put this up and gave you the exact date because it's so easy these days to say, she's making that up, or that didn't happen. To go into negation, to go into denial, to do anything but concentrate on the facts. That is the fact. And this was his decree. By the authority of Almighty God, conferred upon us, and of the vicarship of Jesus Christ, which we hold on earth, I do grant, and assign to you Portugal and Spain, and your heirs and successors, kings of Castile and Leon, forever, together with all their dominions, cities, camps, places, and villages, and all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances, all islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered, towards the west and the south, by drawing and establishing a line. He took a map of the then known world, so that's what he's referring to. By drawing a line from the Arctic pole, namely the north, to the Antarctic pole. With this proviso, however, that none of the islands and mainlands be in the actual possession of any Christian king. So what this Pope Alexander does is essentially he divides up a map of the then known world, and he simply says, as long as it's not Christian, meaning it's not under the Catholic Church at that point, I give you this part of the world. I give you that part. At the date that I wrote this, 530 years, 6 months, and 9 days later, by now it is, because that was May of 1493, it is now 531 years. That was the 4th, today is the 19th, 15 days that we have been, as a world, suffering because of that papal decree. And with that, 50 years later, it takes time for people to rally to do whatever they're going to do. That's why we have Columbus sailing the world, because he is sailing under the decree of Pope Alexander VI. He has been given license to do so. Any of you who just write it down, I'm not going to present it because I want you to look it up for yourselves, to look up Columbus's logbook. And those of you who are in business are familiar with how business plans are written. And when you read Columbus's logbook, the opening pages, what you will see is that it reads like any other business plan. It essentially details what the need is, what the mission is, and what his call to action is, and why the money has been raised for this particular venture, and what you're going to do with the money. And in Columbus's, those first pages of his logbook, he explains that he has been sent by Queen Isabella, that from henceforth, any land that he cites is now her property, because that one told him so. And any peoples that he happens to come across will forever be subjects of the Pope. Now, let's be practical. Was Queen Isabella likely to ever see these lands? No. Was he ever likely to meet the people? No. What we're talking about is money. From henceforward, under pain of the sword, and indeed in those first pages when he finally lands in what was then called Guanahani, the land of the Caribs. And for anybody who still wants to talk about Columbus discovering America, I ask you if someone from among the Cherokee could go discover London and it would still be okay with you? All right? Nobody discovers someone else's home. This was a mission of conquest. It was a plague that was unleashed worldwide to places of color, the continents where the Catholic Church was not supreme. And so once he lands, he holds out his sword. The people see him and they say, "What is this? These 3 ships in the harbor, who is this?" And he sees these overdressed people come off the ship, and they're in their regalia, and they're rather arrogant, and they're doing whatever, and they go to sea. and he holds out his sword to them and encourages them to touch it. They don't have that kind of sword. They essentially cut themselves. That's psychological warfare, when you invite the person you're going to do something to injure themselves. And he says that they will make good servants because they now tell us to do whatever we tell them to do. In his first day, he has concluded that these will be good servants, and he promises to bring a few of them with him when he goes home as his souvenirs. And he also says that they appear to have no religion, so they will make good converts to Catholicism. Now, how does he know in his first day whether they have a religion or they don't? It doesn't matter. His mission and what he got the money to do in this business venture was to go conquer whatever places he sees. And so, from thenceforward, he and his sons will be given like governorships, and they will actually say, this is my land, but it is in service of the queen. Everybody that they see will then be conscripted from then forward to pay taxes to Spain and tithes to the Catholic Church. That's what our tithes are for. That's what our taxes are for. Taxes to the crown, tithes to the Catholic Church. Wherever they went, in this so-called age of exploration, that's what has been done. That's why we have had the terrors of 500 years of this slave trade. And I know there are some people who want to say, well, the Africans helped with it. I, years ago, was on the board of the Amistad America. Many of you have seen the movie about the Amistad. And the vessel that arrived and the people overthrew their captors, and their case went up to the Supreme Court. And that is the first human rights case that was won by the victims in the US Supreme Court. And it was won just very quickly because of a technicality, really. We all know, we've all watched enough Law and Order, even if we're not attorneys, to know that you cannot retry someone if they have been found innocent in the first case. Well, the Amistad captives had been found innocent of the charges against them in the first trial locally in Connecticut. They had been found innocent in the circuit court. And the president at the time, who I believe was Jackson, petitioned to have them charged at each point. And the reason was that their victory, America was a slaveocracy, their victory would be considered setting a bad example for slaves, the enslaved. And so, but the technicality was one of the last documents Thomas Jefferson signs as president in 1808 is the end of the transatlantic slave trade. It's an international treaty. And it is clear, in spite of what the captains of the Amistad say, it is clear there are 4 children on board, that none of whom speak any European language. They don't understand it in any way. That they could not have been enslaved in Cuba or Spain, where they're lying and saying they were enslaved, because the only language they speak is their African Mendi language. And so the fact that the children in 1839 are too young by 1841, by the time it reaches the Supreme Court, who from 1808 to 1841, it's clear that these people were brought here in violation of the transatlantic slave trade. That's the technicality that frees them. I was part of the board that created a replica of that vessel to sail the Americas and actually go back to the continent to actually tell the story of the victims and ultimately the victors in part of the Amistad. And I mention that to you because in the entire time while we're doing that, we are on site at Mystic Seaport, just outside of New London. I mean, not New London, Mystic, Connecticut, north of New London. And we have all these, you know, everything around us is about the history of the sea, right? As long as African people, we learned that the first vessels were actually built in Egypt. So shipbuilding began in Egypt. And in all those years, there was not one vessel that sailed from the African continent and went someplace and said, "You want Mom? Here she is. Give me $5. Not one. So it's not that the Africans did not know how to sail. It's not that they did not have some kind of oppression as well. But, you know, right now, if you go and you buy stolen property, it's not just, if you knowingly buy stolen property, you are guilty. Shouldn't human beings be entitled to the protection you would give a stolen watch? And that was not the case. And so with that decree, to this day, 531 years and 14 days later, the non-Euro-Christian world, hundreds of millions of people of color worldwide, is still plagued by the hubris of one powerful man dispensing favors, seized lands and taxes, to two other powerful men, crown heads of Spain and Portugal, in exchange for souls, congregants, their descendants, and their tithes, because from that moment, it is decreed that this will forever be the case. Unleashing the reign of terror, euphemistically sanitized as the age of exploration. Now, here we are. Where do we set the clock? Where do we set the clock on not prioritizing the villainous and the political over human rights? Where do we set that clock? That is the conversation that I think we need to have. That is the conversation that unleashed the plague that also has damaged, has created the horrific treatment of how the Jews were treated in Europe. That is the setting of the clock that says it's okay to invade, rape, pillage, and steal from the African continent, Asia, the Americas. Where do we set the clock? And when do we stop? And so that is my take on what is going on and the battle that is going on in the United States about, and it's also interesting, this month, May, some of you know, some of you don't know, the history of student activism took a mean turn in May of 1974, when Kent State University, the National Guard, raged on campus and killed students on campus protesting the Vietnam War. And then later, 2 weeks later, at Jackson State in Mississippi. And in fact, the pictures of Jackson State are even more horrific than the pictures of Kent State, because at Kent State, the students were actually outside protesting. And so you can say, well, they did this, they did that. In Jackson State, what you see are glass windows on an upper floor of a dormitory. This was a National Guard riot. the students who were killed in their rooms, minding their business, going about their day. And the spray of gunfire all over that campus as those students protest. Some students, sure, of course, they're African-American students. It's the 1970s. Of course they're going to protest segregation and this ongoing terrorism because of this reign of terror. Of course they're going to protest it. But the students who were killed that day were in their bedrooms. So we have to see these things in context. I'll come back to other things, but not before I come down to talk to you. And do we still have the mic? So that I can take questions from anyone, and we can have a conversation about it.
So your mic up, right, Janice? Anybody have a question?
Around here in the aisle.
Oh, you okay? Watch that step.
Yes, that and this.
You okay?
Yes, thank you. Ooh, thank you. May I sit here with you and then we can have a closer conversation?
Let's do that.
Okay.
Anybody have a question? I can't. Is this Epworth United Methodist? Am I in the wrong building? There's no questions here.
And I'm gonna have to ask you, Todd, to repeat them so that I can hear them.
Okay. Alicia.
I'm not gonna hear you, I'm sorry, Alicia.
Yes, Janice, I was reviewing your website, and I believe it's either 25 or...
Is Bo here? I really can't hear.
Okay.
I can't even hear it well. I know I'm having problems, but not that much.
On your website, the 25 books or 50 books of African American
Oh, the
history.
50 books?
Yes, can you share a little bit
Yes,
more?
thank you, Alicia. On my website, there is, if you go to janusadams.com, and my name is Janus Adams.com, you will see there is a picture of, actually, it's an ancient African manuscript that picture is, so you can go to see that as well. Because once again, we're told everybody, other than the Europeans, nobody wrote, nobody has culture, nobody has this, it's all a lie. So I put a picture there, and I have offered to people, you just have to sign up for it, it's free. It's called 50 Books That Changed the Story of African America. And I've done this list of the 50 books because the story is not a story that includes that. The story is not a story that includes setting a bad example for slaves because you are enslaving someone and stealing their lives and their children's lives and my life in different ways down to today. That's not the story. And so it begins with the first book by an African American author is actually one of America's first child prodigies, and it's a young black African girl who was, and you know, this is one of the things we have to face too about the whole issue of slavery, is they kidnapped her, sold her, brought her from Gambia to Boston Harbor. She's named Phyllis for the slave ship that she came on, and Wheatley for the owners, the people who bought her. And so Phyllis Wheatley is the person who is the first known published author. And she was brought as a child, and it was from counting her baby teeth that they think she was about 7 years old when this kidnapped child came into harbor. And because she was so sickly, they could not use her as a slave, and so they began to teach her along with their children. And she excelled at it so greatly that she begins to write, and write in her own way. And in fact, there is a trial for her where she has to prove that she actually was capable of writing her own, the things that she had actually written. And to his credit, among the it said in the introduction to her book, the most notable characters in Boston was someone who wrote his literal John Hancock, because he was John Hancock, who did certify her authentic, that she had written that. Not one publisher in the United States would print her work because it was considered dangerous. She would be, once again, setting a bad example for slaves. You know, you're supposed to be subservient. I said you're nothing, you're going to be nothing, and she was obviously not, and so nobody would publish it. They had to take her and her work to London, and that's where her book was published. Yeah, so you will see. Phyllis Wheatley, I have it in Sister Days, but right now I'm going on memory. We are talking around, it's before the Revolution. So it's around 1763, something like that. I'll check the exact date before I go in, I'll tell you. So, anybody else? So you can find 50 books that changed the story of African America. That's it. Thank you, Bo. That's it. Okay? And you'll see half of that picture on my homepage. You can just click through and you'll get there. And then it goes right up to contemporary works. But every month in my newsletter, I give another one or two of them. You will also find, I list this one because even though this is from Timbuktu in like the 1300s, it was not found because once Europeans sacked Timbuktu, these manuscripts were hidden away in private homes for about 400 years. And so it's in the 1950s that they begin to feel okay with with people taking back their independence from Europe, with decolonization, and the manuscripts resurface. And so I actually have it much later that it changed the story of African America, but I put it at the front.
I've got a question while you're thinking of your questions. How's that? So our talk tonight talked about turning silence into action. And after hearing you, you're a historian, going way back 500 some years. You have such a great perspective of where the world is. The rest of us don't hold that candle as bright as you do. So how do we build our voice when we see injustice in our little community right here? How do we have the courage to speak up?
Thanks, Todd. You know, when I get that question, and I often get that question, so what can we do? What can we do? And my answer is, I can't tell you what you can do, but I can tell you this, because I don't know you. I don't know your skills. I don't know your passions. I don't know what each of you is bringing to the table. I only know that everybody is bringing something. And so my answer is usually this. First of all, know what is right. There is not one religion in the world, Pastor Vicky will agree, that does not have at its core, not one reasonable religion in the world, that does not have at its core, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Frankly, that's all you need to know. And we are given all these false equivalencies. I'm sorry, January 6th was not anything but what you saw, and no matter what anybody tries to convince you that it was not, it was this, it was that, you know, they show you somebody with a suitcase and say it was a suitcase. When you look at it, you find that instead it was the way they transport all these, they have to put all these votes in something. They say, no, it was something that they were using. They tell you what they want you to see so that you will believe them. But if you ask the next question, which is, well, how are votes normally transported? You'll see that they're all using basically the same things. You know, in industry, we all have these industries, and once an industry has something, it's usually the same thing, like the voting booths are not only used in one state and not another, it's the manufacturer. So you're gonna see a consistency. But you're asked not to think. So I can tell you, use your core, that do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Use your critical thinking skills, and then do one thing tomorrow that you would not have done yesterday because it scares you. That's all I can tell you. No? Okay. No.
Hello.
Hello, my dear. As we were talking about this, raising your voice and doing what you can, I'm reminded of John Wesley writing many years ago, do all the good you can, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can.
Oh, I love that. Did you write that?
John Wesley.
Oh, you wrote it a long time before. I told you I couldn't hear you. Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. Anybody else?
So you mentioned that so much of this history is not being taught, and we've heard it, especially in the South, but we hear it around here too, that we don't want children to feel guilty or the topics are too difficult for them. So as a community, how can we make sure that we are learning those stories and we're helping our children, not just our own personal children, but the children of the community are learning these stories as well, so that the history isn't whitewashed?
Thank you for asking that. You know, there are states right now where I'm illegal. And I'm not just illegal because I've written some books. I can't even go into Florida and tell the truth about my being one of the 4 children who became the, quote, test children. Northern school desegregation pioneer. I had just turned 9 to desegregate New York State, New York schools. I can't talk about that. Indeed, there was a publisher in Florida who was writing a book on Rosa Parks and could not say that the issue that she was black, it was segregated South, and white people did not want her to sit where she was sitting on the bus. So what you have is a crazy woman who is creating a scene on a bus about a seat rather than just sitting down and being quiet. That's what we have right now. And so to your point, I just have to remind myself and everybody that the people who are saying these things, despite what they would want you to believe, they're not the only taxpayers in the United States. They're not the only ones who have a right to the libraries. They're not the only ones who pay for the schools. And so on that, I can tell you what has to be done, which is that as parents who know what they're, and if other people were trying to intimidate them into doing what they are accusing, of really accusing of being done, nobody would stand for it. So why are we allowing people to come in some cases as egregiously? There have been reports, librarians being terrorized with guns in the library and being given a list of books that the person who's giving the list of books hasn't even read, to say that this library cannot carry these books. That is intimidation. It really has nothing to do with children. It has to do with some people who think they're now a big deal because they can do this. And so you're dealing with some inadequate, scared people who have nothing else going for them, because I'm sorry, anybody who has anything going for them is not going to spend their time on that. And so it does take people standing up and saying, I too am a taxpayer. I too am entitled to the public schools. You don't want your children to read that? Don't have your child read that. I want my child to read that. They have lied at every turn. The whole nonsense about CRT. I happen to know the person who created CRT. His name was Derek Bell. He was an amazing civil rights attorney who was revered for his conscience and his commitment and putting his life on the line to defend what was right and what was just. For that, he was invited at a certain point to become a Harvard Law School professor. And Harvard has a whole body of coursework called the Critical Blank Theory series. And what it is, the critical blank theory is some area of societal endeavor that has driven a body of law. There could be no greater body, subject than race, having driven an entire body of law for hundreds of years, even before it was a country. And so Derek Bell, decided, well, why don't I do critical race theory? Because we don't have it as part of the graduate Harvard Law School curriculum. These lies that were told, that it was being told to children in school, well, frankly, the children in school don't need it, because there isn't a 5-year-old who can't say to you, that's not fair, all right? So the 5-year-olds don't need it. But the 50-year-olds who did not want to be accountable for it are the ones who are blaming it on the 5-year-olds. Derek Bell created critical race theory, and it was purely a scholarly enterprise, and you can look his name up, not the nonsense that people are lying to us and saying it is. They have appropriated it. I've forgotten his name. I think I have expunged his name from my record, where he literally comes upon this word, and he's angry because he was in a session about diversity and inclusion. And he's obviously a racist, and he does not want to be told that he has to not be racist. And so he goes on some television show locally, and then they decide it's a good idea, and somehow the White House, because we all know that when that one was president, they used to talk about how much time he wasn't even in the office, he was watching TV. Well, one of the shows that he was watching, they saw this man talking about he's heard the word critical race theory, and it sounds better than diversity and inclusion, so he uses that. And the White House invites him to the White House to now talk about this group, this lies, and that is how the entire country becomes hysterical over critical race theory. Christopher Rufo is his name, and he wrote an article taking proud responsibility for doing it. DeSantis has recently named him to this new board that he has for education, that he has reappointed the education board, and he named this propagandist to that board. And so the upsets that are going on in Florida higher education have to do with him putting people out of the faculty and the colleges and universities in Florida based on his misrepresentation and misstatement, not only of critical race theory, but of what is going on in campuses. The other thing that I want to mention is that the United States has an interesting history, and it goes before it's the United States. In my book, Freedom Days, the one that I gave Todd and Alicia, they have it, I don't have it with me. It's a book about the civil rights era and the history of the civil rights era. It's out of print. I hope to have it back in. If you go on Amazon or Barnes & Noble in their exchange, where you can sometimes get copies, every once in a while one comes up when libraries are changing over their inventory, and one will come up and it might have a Dewey Decimal Code on the side, but it's there. In that introduction, I talk about what I call the cycle of the 60s and the 90s. I'm going to sit here so I can see everybody and not have my back. The cycle, somebody else can have this, because I'm still mic'd?
Yes.
Am I still mic'd?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
What's that? Is it better for this one? Okay, he says it's better.
It's better for this one? All right, thank you. So the cycle of the 60s and 90s. Always historically in the United States, pre-United States, in the colonies from the 1660s, there has always been a period of freedom, of talk of freedom, of moving things forward. By the 90s, things are always crashing down. We are trained to believe that our history is a straight trajectory. Yeah, we have a little problem here or there, but basically it's all about progress. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so in the 1660s, there is, I think it's called the Christiana Revolt and a rebellion, and they're saying no to things that are repressive. By the 1690s, that's the Salem witch trials, okay? 1750s, 60s, you go to colonial Williamsburg. That's the period it's depicting, where you see everybody walking around and the revolution is the talk of the day, and they're talking about the freedom of the colonies and all of this. We know what happens in 1776. We know what happens, it becomes a country. We know that then they're having a constitutional convention. By 1793, we have, the 90s again, we have the first fugitive slave law. The African-American men who are free men, who sacrifice their freedom to fight, they're given the choice of fighting on the side of the British or on the colonists. Most choose to fight on the side of the colonists, thinking that what they will be doing is that they will be freeing their loved ones still enslaved, okay? And so most of the black men fight on the side of the colonists. The payback for that in 1793, instead of freedom for their loved ones, is the first fugitive slave law. 1850s, 60s, same ratcheting up. That's why John Brown's revolt, 1859, is his attack on Harper's Ferry is called the opening shot of the Civil War. It's that same 1850s again. By 1860s, you then, Civil War, the North is victorious. You have the so-called Freedom Amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, with which Trump is violating and being allowed to violate right now because he was part of an insurrection. We all know he was part of an insurrection, and he is being allowed to violate the Constitution. Those amendments enacted in the wake of the Civil War. Anyway, in this cycle of the 60s and 90s, By 1896, what do you have? Plessy versus Ferguson. And yesterday was the anniversary of Plessy versus Ferguson. And I've written a piece about the 60s and 90s, but a piece, an article, it'll come up. If you can put into the search, if you hear me, Bo, I'd appreciate it. Put in the Huffington Post, my name, and put in teetered or teeter-totter. I think it's called teetered or teetering. But if you just put in T-E-E-T-E-R, it'll come up with my name in the Huffington Post. Thank you. And I wrote that article about the odd confluence that May 17th is the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Ed. I've said I'm one of the people who was not involved in that, but 2 years later, part of the school desegregation. But that's May 17th, 1954. The very next day, not chronologically, but on the calendar, is May 18th, 1896. And I call the article teeter-totter, whatever, when he finds it, because it is odd. It is an odd, it's more than odd, it is a disheartening emblem. That's it. Thank you. And you can pull that up. It's an odd emblem of iconography of what happens in American history with this back and forth, the moving forward on the 17th and the shutting down on the 18th. And so right now, that's what we're going through. Those Supreme Court decisions, I hate to be, well, I'm telling the truth, but I hate to sound negative, but the truth is not negative. The truth is what is, and then when we confront it. You ask what we can do, we can tell the truth, and we can confront it. The recent Supreme Court decisions against voting rights, against affirmative action, against school desegregations, are the 1896 decisions of our era. That is essentially pushing this country back the way Plessy versus Ferguson opening the door on so-called legal segregation, which was the reign of terror that makes Brown v. Board of Ed necessary. And that's what we have just experienced. So those students are out there for a reason. They're out there because what they see is wrong. But they're also out there because the highest court has given sanction to things they know that are wrong. When my generation was out there for either the civil rights movement or for Vietnam, it was because we knew it was wrong to continue the colonization and the forced colonization of other peoples the world over. And that's what the Vietnam War was about. We were made to say that it was about the soldiers who were conscripted. Those soldiers were not the problem. The problem were the decisions that had been made that sent those young men. And the battles that we had, the haywire gunfire of the National Guard that kills students at Kent State, that kills the students at Jackson State. What we're not dealing with is the truth of the fact that we had two groups of young people pitted against each other. We had those who were college students with student deferments pitted against those who had been drafted and were lucky enough to be in the National Guard, but were still drafted. And that's, you have a class warfare and a societal warfare that comes up against each other. That's what we were seeing. And right now we have students on on the front lines because they know that it's not just some decision. The rest of their lives are going to be conditioned by what is going on now. The decisions that are being made on women's rights are going to be decided on what's going on now. Thank goodness the decision that was finally made by the United Methodist Church. Yes. If that had not been made, it would be, you mean forever? We're supposed to, I remember losing a job as a journalist because I was, you know, all right, someone says, we would like you, we're going to syndicate your column, we'd like you to write a column and, you know, write it on this subject so that we can just see how you respond. All right, fine. It's just that what they asked me to do was to write a column that used my civil rights experience to essentially say that gay people had no rights. And I said no. And I obviously did not get the job. But I happen to have a stepson and a stepdaughter, both of whom are gay. And my question was, so who is welcome at my table? I also had someone that I knew who was very violent towards his wife. So you're telling me the heterosexual, violent son of a gun who is willing to beat up anybody in his sight is okay, but the gay person who loves the two people who are part of my family are not? And I said, no. So when we were talking earlier about the price, what all of this is about, this idea of speaking out or silence, what it's about the price you're willing to pay. That's what it's really about. It's each of us deciding the price that we are willing to pay, we are willing for it to cost us as individuals. If you're not willing to have it cost you who you get to play golf with, because, you know, that's where business is done, and this is how we just do it, and the locker room talk, not the Trump locker room talk, but, serious locker room talk. If you're not willing to sacrifice that, is there something else that you're willing to sacrifice? If you're not willing to sacrifice the bridge club, is there something else that you're willing? What are you willing for it to cost you? And at each turn, each of us has to make a decision. What are we willing for it to cost us? And Todd threw that at me earlier today, and I said, I've paid the price. I know it's about a price. I've paid the price, and I'm still paying the price. And I'm not alone. People like me are still paying the price for that Pope and for a whole lot of evil that has been done worldwide in the name of religion. So.
Can you share what you're doing in upstate New York?
Oh, yes, but I'd like Todd to join me for that. Is that one free? Is that one? Oh, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. This is my partner in crime.
Be careful. You'll pay a price for that.
I know. You paid a price for it. I'm staying at your house. Todd told you how we met, and that we stayed in touch after that. And from that, thank you, Alicia, for raising this. From that, I was in 2019. I was awarded an honorary doctorate by my alma mater in New Paltz, New York, State University of New York. And the president, talk about paying the price. I had gone to school, I couldn't hear well, so did you read the I Am the Black Girl thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did.
Okay, and how far into it did you get?
Just the Peter Buffett, small piece of it.
Okay. Part of my being awarded this honorary doctorate was because I had been asked to come back to school and to speak about the fact that I had graduated from the university and not returned in 40 years. And the question was why? And have I told you the reason why? Okay. The reason why is because when I was in school, I had had a terrible incident where one night, I was in the theater department at that point, and I remind people to remember, and in fact, when I've said this on campus, the students don't know what I'm talking about, that girls had hours and boys didn't. Girls would be campused, forced to stay in as punishment for violating something that boys didn't even have. Well, anyway, it was a rainy night, and they had forgotten to turn in my hours, and I go fleeing into the night because I'm about to be campused again for being late. As I'm coming through town to get down to the house where I'm living, a car pulls up next to me. We were told freshman orientation, whenever you see a state car, it's either a faculty member or somebody of the administration. You can trust that person. So that's what it is. And the person says, what are you doing out? It's late, it's not safe. Get in, I will take you. Where do you live? And he says, oh, it's right down here. And he knows that the shortcut. So he said, I will take you there, get in. And I do, believing him. And he does. He drives straight to the house where I live. And as I get out of the car, he literally reaches under my raincoat through my legs and pulls me back in and starts speeding off towards the mountains. Door flapping. I get away from him, honestly. It was a rainy night. I had my umbrella. I get away from him by stabbing him repeatedly with my umbrella. The police are called that night. And when the police get there, they keep wanting me to describe the person who attacked me. And I tell them the state car. And they're saying, no. We need the person who attacked you. We know, was it an apple picker? And at that point, apple picker is the derisive name for the people of color who used to come to that area seasonally every year as migrant workers to really support those farms. But they were derisively called apple pickers. And he wants me to say that the person who attacked me was an apple picker. And I say no, and I start describing the man. It's a white man, he looks like, I can still see the guy. His briefcase is in the back seat. He has on a gray suit. I can go through the whole thing. And at one point, one of the police slams his notebook on his knee and says, why, you little whore? You think we are going to ruin a good man's life for a whore like you? Now, that was a period of time when you could not change. My father had died very young. He had died recently as just my mom and me. And at that point, we could not move our credit. So I could not leave the university without losing a whole year and having to pay a whole extra year or two tuition because of what this police officer has just done and what the attacker has just done. So my mom and I decide that I'm gonna have to stay and stick it out, or, or we're gonna lose all of this. Once I graduated, I never went back. Finally, someone reaches out to me and has been reading my columns and books or something and realizes that there's a connection. And she vets me for an event, vets me for something that she wants me to do as an alumni. We have a meeting. And ultimately, she decides in that meeting that I should be doing what becomes the annual Distinguished Speaker Lecture. I used to say, and can you imagine, the year before, it was one of the Kennedys who who preceded me to the microphone, but you know which Kennedy I'm going to name, and I therefore no longer think it was the credit that I thought it was. But it literally was their distinguished speaker lecture, and I come, and they ask me what the topic of my speech is going to be. Now, I don't know that in naming my speech, it's going to be plastered all over the campus on, not only on billboards, but these flags and, you know, things are gonna hang all over the main walkways. It's gonna be in newspapers, every place. And I tell them that the name of my speech, I will do it, but the name of my speech is Know When to Leave the Plantation. Okay. And the president of the university, knowing better than to say you can't, invites me to lunch. And so I go, and he asks me why. Wonderful, his name is Donald Christian. He asks me why, and I tell him why. And I tell him that it's not just what happened to me 40 years ago, but on my way to this vetting event, I saw an incident, I'm not going to go into the whole thing right now, but where a young man was jacked up by police for something that obviously was just their way of intimidating this teenage young man, because if he really was guilty of anything, they would have taken him in. They did not need to stand in the middle of Ellenville on the main road, essentially doing nothing but a sexual assault in the middle of the street, which is what they were doing. And I'm so frantic when I get to this. I've tried to go back and help the kid, and then I couldn't get back, and, you know, and so I just say, it's not just about what happened to me, but here we are all these years later, by that time 50 years later, and we have, when I'm asked to do the speech, and we have young people today who are being treated as badly as I was. Who are they going to go to on campus? Every young man on that campus say, I don't need a father, I'm grown. Every single one of them in that position at that age needs somebody who is a dad or a surrogate dad, especially if he's in the situation that I had just seen. And I say, who? And I'm finding that nobody is really on campus stepping up to take that role. And so my speech is not about just what happened to me then. It is about, it's time to leave the plantation behind with this mistreatment of black people just because you can now. And so when I tell him that, he says, I guess that's the name of the speech. And I say, yes. And he then says to me, what would you like your legacy to be, if it could be anything? And I haven't a clue, because despite the dye that I have in my hair right now, who thinks the legacy is something your grandmother does? It's not something you have. And so I don't know, but what I finally blurt out is, I see the need for an Institute for History and Healing. And he says, we're going to do it. I think you're absolutely right, we're going to do it. Fast forward, he cannot do it. The state has a shortfall. Every department is told to cut their budget. If we do it, you won't be treated well. So I think about it. It's in the pandemic has now begun. I have met and been invited to join Athena. And I'm thinking about all of this. And I call him and I say, if I thought it was a good idea then, why isn't it a good idea now? Just because, you know, the university can't do it. If I do it, will you be on the board? He's the first one I called, and he says yes. And that's when I tell you no. Because Todd then shortly after that asks me if I will be on the board of Athena, and we stay friends. But what we do is that by that point, we have been having these monthly conversations, and I have started this institute with people, who believe in it, and we're figuring out what it's going to be. And at some point, I mentioned to him that this is what I'm doing, and he says, well, if opportunity ever comes, I would like to be part of it. Today, we sit together, and Todd is vice president of the Institute for History and Healing. We are getting into a whole lot of what John Lewis would call good trouble. We are in the process of trying to acquire a 200-acre historic property in Stone Ridge, New York. Do we need 200 acres? No, we do not need 200 acres. But the reason why is because it has a historic so-called Dutch stone house on the property. Not only that, there is a slave cottage that's part of that. At the back of the property, on the other side, so I can't even just say, I'll just take this portion, is an African burial ground that has to be preserved, and there is also a sawmill, an historic old sawmill. And I'm saying, well, I see something here that this needs to be preserved. This needs to tell the story. It needs to tell the story because what I haven't said is that in the years since I had first started school, I had become fascinated with these so-called historic Dutch stone houses. Yes, the Dutch come upstate New York. The Dutch have 3 ports because of, well, since that's no longer the Pope up there, I can't point over there, but because of that Pope, the Dutch have 3 ports on the African coast. They have the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, and the Slave Coast. Just one more commodity. And where they bring those people from is to the port in Kingston, New York, and Kingston, New York is depending on where you are in Kingston and where you are in Stone Ridge, is 5 to 10 miles apart. And I begin to study these Dutch stone houses that have seized my imagination for 50 years and say, who built those houses? Clearly, the people who built those houses are the enslaved people. That's what they brought them there for. And I also find one other sign. I am trying to buy one of those houses for my family. I had always had this dream that I would, one day when I grow up, I'm going to buy a stone house that I can restore and write about. And but I've studied them over those years, and there's one that I think I might be able to get, and I go in and it has deteriorated so that it has an iron stay holding the outer walls together, and the iron stay is clearly built into the walls. And I say, well, who were the iron workers of this period? This house is the 1700s. And the iron workers of the period, known the world over today for the Benin bronzes, are the people of Benin, the people who were kidnapped, enslaved, and shipped to the Americas, who were in upstate New York. And that tells me I'm right. The people who built those houses were not only Africans, but now we know they're the people of Benin, because that's who was enslaved in the area. And there's one more component. When you look at the kind of footprint of where these so-called Dutch stone houses are in upstate New York, that footprint echoes the footprint of indigenous, in this case Lenape, but indigenous stone chambers, actual stone structures. So I'm realizing that when we see what we call a Dutch stone house, once again, why the history can't be told as it should be, is because we are seeing not the Dutch stone houses, but we are seeing the confluence of 3 cultures. The indigenous people who had been building, these are not caves, these are actual stone structures. We have the Africans who were brought to be enslaved to do all the work here. And yes, the Dutch colonists. That's what we're looking at. And so that's why the stone houses have become so important to us. And now, having given you all of that, I'm going to ask Todd to tell, why did he listen to this crazy woman and decide he wanted to be part of the Institute for History and Healing?
I'm actually hard of hearing. That was, no, I'm kidding. Actually, that's partially true. But no, it's been a pleasure working with Janus on this project. And we do need to go here in a minute. So we won't go into the whole details of buying this stone house. But if you think of a reality show on television, a dysfunctional family, times 10, that is the family that owns this house. So Janus's patience in working through all this is pretty amazing. We've got a great board of people, and actually, straight out, as we come to a close here, Janus has got, pardon me, copies of your book, Sister Days. And what is the cost of the book?
$35.
$35.
It's first edition hardcover. It's the last of the first edition.
So a few of those out there, I'm sure she'll sign it for you if you'd like to. There's also information on what do we tell our children, which is a new initiative that we have underway, and Janus has done a great job of putting thoughts together for parents, grandparents, on what do we tell our children. Well, what we heard tonight, I just think about the history that I was taught in good old Minneapolis, Minnesota growing up. Boy, I should have had a few questions to ask. Didn't have the courage. I do now. But can't we help the next generation to look at that? And she also has a board game out there that I'm sure you'd be happy to explain more about as well. So we have more Janus Adams things straight out as you come in. I think Janus is glad to stick around for a few minutes after. Why don't we give a great round of applause to Janus Adams. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for coming out.
That's extended applause. We'll take that anytime, right? Let's have Pastor Vicki close us out tonight. And again, thank you so much for coming.
So thank you so much. I have learned a lot and realize, again, the more I learn, the more there is to learn. And so one of the things I want to encourage us here is we have so much beautiful history of African-American struggle, of course, with Bryan Stevenson, and also being the one of the schools that was part of the Brown versus Board of Education, and one of our lawyers was part of the arguing team. And then, of course, we have Harriet Tubman, who, led so many people out, and so you can go through the byway, you can go over to the beautiful museum if you haven't been. And then, of course, we're close to D.C., the African American Museum, if you've never been there. It's just so powerful. And so I think for me, part of the call to action tonight is to continue to learn those stories, and especially the stories that root us here, because we also have Native American presence here. The Lenape is part of the tribe that is here, between the Nanacoke and the Lenni Lenape, and there are a lot of tribes that were part of this area. And yes.
They have been reduced to being called tribes, but these were nations.
They were
No
nations.
different than if you say the French tribe.
Exactly,
It's deliberately
exactly.
done to demean them.
Right. They were nations. They absolutely are. And still are. I mean, there are still, survivors who continue to tell their stories. But hopefully, I hope that you all have heard a call tonight to continue to learn and grow and to find ways to share these stories. One of my favorite stories about a church was in Florida when AP Black history was no longer allowed to be taught in one of the high schools. It was the United Methodist Church that said, we'll teach it here. And they got the teachers from the school, put their classroom there, so that they couldn't charge them for teaching the class in a church. And to me, that was just a wonderful example of ways that we can then move from silence to action. And how do we do that? So I'm so grateful for you all being here tonight. I hope that we can continue this conversation because I know I look around, I see so many familiar faces, and we've had conversations like this before. But one of the things that I think that Dr. Adams has, re-emphasized is that it does take a community. It's not just going to be one of us. And so you all are a part of that community, and I'm so grateful for you for being here tonight. And pray that as we continue to try to live these stories, that we will find ways to come together and to move from that silence into action. So thank you all for being here, and invite you again to speak with Dr. Adams out in the foyer. Thank you.
I think I have to retreat.